A road that takes a different turn is one of the gifts and greatest challenges of a life that is encapsulating that idea of spirited searching. Earlier this month, this is actually a really timely topic for me, because earlier this month I began working with a Wellspring clergy group. Now, Wellspring is a UU program of spiritual discernment circles, if you will. We meet twice a month over the course of about 9 months and discuss things that we've read and what's going on in our spiritual lives. And in this week's session, we discussed this book by Parker Palmer, a Quaker teacher, called A Hidden Wholeness: The Journey Toward an Undivided Life, Welcoming the Soul and Weaving Community in a Wounded World. All of which sounds pretty enticing. Now, this book has, and the conversation that followed it in my Wellspring group, have woven their way throughout this entire service, including but not limited to the video that we watched earlier. And I love these magical moments when these auspicious confluences occur between what's going on in my life and what's going on in the worship life of the congregation. It helps me to remember that just as worship is where we name and connect to what is of greatest value in our lives, creating worship itself is also a sacred act. In Wellspring groups, participants are also expected to engage in a daily spiritual practice. And I almost downloaded the sound of a record scratching or a car screeching to a halt to describe that idea of a daily spiritual practice, because before we go any further, I need to make a confession. I have never sustained over a consistent long period any kind of daily practice or habit of the mind or spirit. As a writer, my colleagues in my MFA program would talk about how they get up at 4 a.m. or take time at lunch or whatever to write every day. I never did. As a UU, as a minister, it's a little bit embarrassing. As a person who wants and seeks the depth of experience that comes from a life of intention and discipline and spiritual growth, I've spent a lot of time beating myself up for not being very good at spiritual practices. So today, when we reflect on spirited searching, I'm going to talk a lot about spiritual practice. And I want you to know how bad I am at it. This is not a plea for sympathy or for reassurance. We'll get around to, don't worry, I'm okay now. But this is my attempt to let you know that when I lead worship, I'm leading from a place of being a person with something to learn, especially today, which is why I joined that Wellspring group in the first place. And why today, talking about spirited searching might sound a lot like talking about spiritual practice. But bear with me, because we're going somewhere. My colleague, the Reverend Kathleen McTeague, describes rituals as elevated routines with set intentions, attention, and repetition. Elevated routines with intention, attention, and repetition. This is true of rituals like worship services, even when they happen online. And it is also true of those things that we call spiritual practices. What in your life would benefit from intention, from direct attention, or routine repetition? For myself, a better question might be, what wouldn't benefit? I don't know about you, but I have been about to start a great new routine next week since approximately March of last year. So attention, intention, and repetition have a role in spiritual practice. They also are something that could benefit many, many aspects of our lives. So what is a spiritual practice exactly? Now, if I asked you to close your eyes and imagine spiritual practice, what image comes to your head? For me, it has always been a vision of a room with lots of like white walls and wood panels and natural light and lots of leafy green plants and maybe some nice music playing in the background and a mug of tea and a yoga mat. This room is not in my house. This room exists, but it does not exist for me. It's no wonder I thought I was so bad at spiritual practice, because I had set myself up with a literally unobtainable vision of what good enough looks like in terms of a spiritual practice. I had also set a vision for myself that wasn't really what I wanted to do. It was what I thought I should be doing. And as a spirited seeker, a curious curator of my own experience, I noticed that this is not an isolated struggle. How often do we set ourselves up for literally unobtainable visions of what good enough looks like? What might happen if we were to apply our attention and intention toward noticing when we have set ourselves up for something that we cannot or do not wish to attain? I wonder what would happen if we made a practice of examining the standards that we set for ourselves in terms of sustainability rather than in terms of an ideal. I don't know what you would notice in your life by this practice, but for me, those questions invite both wisdom and discomfort. A life of spirited searching is as likely to leave us with discomfort as with wisdom, though one often comes from the other. Our spirited search can grow out of joy and abundance and fullness, but more often, our spirited search is a commitment that we have forged by an awareness of lack, of disconnect, of division. I have a visual aid today. It's a very fancy visual aid, a piece of paper. Parker Palmer talks about this piece of paper in his book, and this is where this comes from. He talks about how we all have an onstage and a backstage self. On stage, this is probably pretty intuitive, is the image that we present to the world, how we influence the world, how we impact the world. The questions we ask are, is anyone listening? Did I make a difference? Has anyone noticed me? And how do I look while I'm trying? And this is about what we present to the world. The backstage ideas, intuitions, feelings, values, and faith. This is who we are when no one is watching. This is who we are when we are alone. In a deeper sense, this might be our mind, our heart, our spirit, our soul, and the place in ourselves where those things take the lead. Now, as a child, we don't have a piece of paper like this. We are not born with this separation. We start out utterly unself-conscious. But over time, we learn to build walls. And that is what this represents, the two-sided piece of paper with our interior and exterior selves. Some people build this earlier, and some people build it as they grow into adulthood. It dawns on us that the world is a hard place, a scary place, and that the most fragile parts of ourselves need protecting. We all can probably point to a moment or an aspect of ourselves that has led to this wall being built to protect our own soft underbellies of the heart. But here is the ultimate irony of the divided self. If I live behind the wall long enough, the inner self that I am trying to protect disappears. The wall and the other world become all that there are, and we forget that there is another possibility. So, we yearn to be centered as a result. Circle. We want to live a life that is guided not by the onstage self, but by the inner self, to make choices that are boundaried by our own deep values and needs. Now, this is a better way of being than forgetting about the interior life, but it can also look a lot like circling the wagons, like a gated community where we only welcome the things with which we are comfortable. In this way, when we use truth to create divisions, the circle becomes the wall in disguise. Now, I'm gonna try and do this with my, I got it. My piece of paper is too thick, but this is a Mobius strip. I'm gonna get some tape here so that it will stay in place. And if you have built one of these at home, you know what I'm about to show you. You can build one yourself. Just make a circle and then flip one end before you connect them. If I start on the inside and I trace my finger around, I eventually come to the outside. So, or what seems to be the other side, I should say, because the two apparent sides keep turning into each other. And Parker Palmer says, whatever is inside us continually flows outward to help form or deform the world. And whatever is outside us continually flows inward to help form or deform our lives. In this Mobius strip way of being, there is just one world, the inner and the outer combined. Spiritual practices, I'm gonna put this over here. Spiritual practices are some of the things that help us remember that the inner world and the outer world are really just one world, and that it is oneness that we are seeking, which is why moments of spiritual clarity are sometimes so hard to describe, as well as so hard to ignore. Our search takes us into thought, but also into intuition, feelings, and sensations. Another one of my colleagues, Reverend James Ishmael Ford, who is also a Zen Buddhist priest, has written this about spiritual practices. He says, spiritual practices are not about making you feel better. They are about walking through a door from one place to another. We are invited to see that our ordinary ideas about who we are rarely accurate as anything more than a vague approximation. Spiritual practice takes us into authenticity, into intimacy with what is. And I love that phrase, taking us into intimacy with what is. Think back to that room in my head. There is nothing wrong with that room, with the tea and all the ferns. If you have such a room, congratulations. It's lovely. Maybe there's incense or music or a slight breeze through the open windows. If I walked into an Airbnb and saw such a room, I would probably swoon a little. I might even make some tea. But as an ideal, it does not bring me into intimacy with what is. What does bring me into intimacy with what is? Floating in my pool and watching the clouds and the trees. Creating my calendar every week with intention and color. Surrounding myself with words of inspiration. I have several on my computer here and even more at my desk so that I am working in a place that reminds me of why this work matters. How I dress brings me into intimacy with what is, thinking about how I want my outer self to reflect my inner self on any given day. Creative work, making beautiful things. I like to make coloring pages. I have recently started doing some embroidery, which is a lot of fun. And I think one of the things that I will be donating to the service auction is a UU inspired piece of embroidery art. We will see, but I have plans. Cooking and eating a meal with someone I love brings me into intimacy with what is. Painting my nails can help me become more present, more intimate with what is. None of these things happens every day, but nearly every day, at least one of these things does happen. And all connect me with that intangible thing toward which I am setting my intention. What Parker Palmer and other Quakers often call the inner teacher, what another mentor of mine called looking to see where the light is going. And in addition to connecting me to that which is beyond, they also connect me to my most interior self. As we know, that which is beyond and that which is inside are constantly co-creating each other. And that is what makes my own spiritual practices work. These are not things set apart from my life, but a part of my life, elevated routine that connects me both to my own soul, that wild thing that I must become quiet to hear, and to my soul's natural habitat. Because ultimately, that is what we are seeking in this spirited search. Not a God, not answers, but our own souls, our best selves, what is true or real or beautiful in any given moment. Those things that connect us, often beyond words. Where do you need to go to find your soul? In what dark place might it be hiding? And what will entice it into the light? Spiritual life, because I think to call it a spiritual practice is not enough. We want to live a life of intention, a life of paying attention. And we want to do this as often as we can. It provides moments of integration, processing space, containers for experience of clarity as well as challenge, often at the same time. Spiritual practices are practices. They help us get better at creating the things that we need to live a life of spirited searching with an eye towards noticing and tuning in to where that inner teacher is present. When I said that before I was really bad at spiritual practices, I forgot that being part of a UU congregation is also a spiritual practice that requires our intention, attention, and repetition. Parker Palmer says, taking an inner journey towards rejoining soul and role requires a rare but real form of community. I'm a Unitarian Universalist in large part because I believe that the life of spirited searching and the search for deeper beauty, for authentic soul, they're not just our birthright. They are a charge that is put on each of us as an essential exercise of human capacity and potential. If we can ask questions, we can quest for answers. And if we can ask questions, we should. I cannot speak with authority on what brought each of you here today, but my guess is that somewhere along the path that led you here, you began looking for something more. More relationship, more understanding of your own heart, more answers for your kids, more places for them to ask their questions, more heart, more spirit, more soul. But more is not always more. Please don't think going away from this service that I am giving you any sort of pressure to add anything to your life. I'm inviting you to look for ways to elevate what is already there. I still don't think I'm very good at spiritual practices, but that yearning, that sense of not quite there yet, being able to touch, but not quite, that is part and parcel to the life of spirited searching. We find satisfaction and contentment along the way, but we also remain restless, curious, and hungry. The Mobius strip represents the adult version of the wholeness into which we were born. As T.S. Eliot famously said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." May your spirited search bring you into new realms of thought, feeling, and experience. And may it bring you into closer relationship with this community that stands ready to welcome you home.